I'm Steve Mann, and welcome to You Can Make a Difference. I grew up on a small potato farm in Idaho, where I quickly learned the value of hard work and developed a desire to see and experience the world beyond the fence line. That curiosity shaped my life. Over the years, I've founded or co-founded 4 successful businesses and 4 humanitarian foundations. I've worked with U.S. presidents, built leadership programs, and moved my family across the world to fight HIV/AIDS in Africa, all by being a husband to my amazing wife and raising a beautiful, multiracial family. I've traveled to more than 50 countries, met countless people, and learned from many cultures. Along the way, like you, I've developed beliefs, principles, and values that matter deeply to me, which I want to pass on to my children, grandchildren, and beyond. That's what this channel is about. You Can Make a Difference explores how we pass on wisdom, not just information, by sharing our stories and life experiences. Today's younger generation doesn't need more data. They need context, perspective, and meaning. Stories help us humanize life, start meaningful conversations, and give the next generation the confidence and clarity they need to navigate a fast-changing world. I'm glad you're here.
This is my good friend, Steve Studdert. Steve has worked for, how many years did you spend in Washington?
Way too many.
18, 20, something like that?
Yeah, way too many.
Worked for 3, 4 presidents.
Yes.
Traveled the world, over 100 countries on assignment from presidents. And also traveled much of the world on assignment from many of the general authorities and doing projects.
Yes.
And so Steve has seen a lot and done a lot and probably could lecture forever, but learn very quickly that nobody listens to lectures. Think of your own kids. Do your kids like lectures?
You know, I was thinking about something just this morning. I don't know that I remember I went to BYU for undergraduate school. I do not remember a single lecture from any professor for 4 years of undergrad curriculum. But I do remember a couple of specific professors who told some stories. The stories were how they communicated the principles of the lesson. I think about BYU devotionals that I went to, but I just do not remember a thing, except I remember Elder Glenn Richards, who I remember his time was up, the red light came on, he put his hand over the red light, and he said, "I feel a story coming on." I remember what he said because it was stories.
Yeah. Yeah. We just are programmed that way, I think, as human beings.
I think it somehow touches an emotional chord as well. I'm thinking about the U.S. hockey game the other day. There was something about that was beyond just sports, that pulled your emotional heartstrings to the point that it engaged you far more than just an average hockey game or an average sporting event. There's something that's bigger. Lectures don't do it. Stories do. And oftentimes the story will be about someone you know, especially if it's a family story. Mm-hmm. So I think you're more interested naturally. Well, this is a story about Grandpa.
Yeah.
I love Grandpa. I want to hear about Grandpa.
You know, I used to read grandkids stories from the storybooks. Ran out of storybooks one time. They wanted a story. When my wife said, "Well, just tell them about when you were a kid." I said, "No, they don't care about that." Boy, was I wrong. I started telling that. They didn't want any more storybooks. Tell us when you were a kid, Dad.
I tried the same thing with our 2 youngest, and I would lay on the bed with them, the 2 youngest, and tell them a bedtime story. I was a total failure because the first one asleep was me every time. I learned later that these 2 were taking bets on what time, how many minutes before I'd be asleep telling the story.
You didn't tell them any stories around when we were in college together.
No, there's still a statute of limitations on it.
Yeah, I thought so. Well, at this session we were at down at the center, you wanted to talk about, among other things, freedom. You spent most of the time telling stories about servicemen, stories in countries you had been where people gave up everything to be free. I could share just one that I had. I was in Singapore many, many years ago, and I was meeting a guy for dinner, and I show up, and he's reading the New York Times. He's got tears in his eyes. I said, what's wrong? And he turns the paper around, and it's the headlines about, murders and drugs and one thing or another. And he says, what are you doing? I said, I don't understand. He says, don't you realize you are our best hope for freedom? And I had read that, but it never registered with me. Like hearing him with tears running down his face, talking about something he hoped he could have.
And as we lose some of that in this country, other countries lose it even faster and more severely.
Yeah.
The United States is the hallmark example for freedom in the world, period.
The light on the hill.
Yeah.
Kind of dim right now.
Flashing red.
What are some experiences that you had that have really made you appreciate freedom?
I went to church once in somewhere in China. I don't remember where we were. But I remember, and this was earlier, in the earlier days of the People's Republic of China being open to any Westerners. Maybe it was only open to diplomats at the time, but I remember I went to a little LDS branch, and I was followed by the secret police. I had to get permission to go, and then I was followed by the secret police. And I thought, in America, I could go to any church of any denomination, any faith I wanted to, anywhere in the country, and not have to ask the government permission, and not be followed by the secret police and monitored. I remember I was an election observer in Hungary in their first election after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I was in a polling place, and I saw, and they actually had voting booths like we do with a curtain. I saw two men walk into this booth together. And I thought, well, this is suspect. This is not free election. I saw them come out, and I saw there was a big ballot box. It was a younger man and an older man. And the older man went over, and he took his hand, and he was hitting on the top of the box to find a slot. And I realized he was blind. So I went over and talked to him. And he said, I just had the best day of my entire life. And he was an elderly gentleman. I said that you could vote. He said, no, that I could close that curtain and not have some government telling me how to vote. To him, it was the best day of his life.
Now, even to me, and I've had stories like that, but that resonates. I feel that. Whereas somebody telling me freedom is important.
I was in Berlin 2 days after the wall opened. I'm with the president of the University of Berlin. And I said, did you know the wall opened? He said, well, actually, no. He said, we were having a dinner party at our home. And he lived in a sort of a high-rise building. And he said, we could hear all this noise outside. And we looked out the window, and here's hundreds, maybe thousands of people running down the street toward the wall. And he said, so we immediately went outside and said, what's happening? And he said, the people said, the wall's open. Of course, he said, we didn't believe that at all, which is a whole other story about how the wall opened. But he said, we didn't believe that at all. I said, what'd you do? He said, we joined the crowd. Heck with the dinner party. We joined the crowd and ran to the wall. I said, when did you get home? He said, 2 days later. And then he said, and I've never forgotten, I said, did you go down and take a hammer and chip on the wall? He said, oh, yes. We chipped our piece off the wall. He said, those hammer sounds were the sounds of freedom being made by the people.
I was with you in Berlin when Reagan was there at Checkpoint Charlie and looks up and says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And a number of years later, I happened to be in Paris and see on the television where they're tearing down the wall and throwing rocks. I did everything I could to try to get on a plane to get to Berlin. And everything was booked. There was no way I was going to get there.
The Germans and all Europeans wanted to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was there 2 days after it opened.
Why are we losing this appreciation or love for freedom?
I don't know that we're necessarily losing it so much as it's not an issue upon which we're focused or paying attention. And I think we saw some sort of backlash. I'm watching the U.S. men's hockey team at a bar in Florida, and the whole bar is singing the national anthem. It said to me, there's a yearning for that.
Yeah.
I fault political leadership generally at all levels for not perpetuating that. You don't hear political leaders, and I'm not sure that's not an oxymoron, political leader, but you don't hear them talk about your duties as a citizen and why it matters. They talk about what's wrong with the other guy rather than, wait a minute, who are we? What do we cherish? We don't hear that. We used to hear it. And part of it is we're changing societally. If you ran the local feed store, you belonged to the local Kiwanis Club or the Rotary.
Yeah.
And you went once a week to a meeting, and one thing you did is you pledged allegiance. Those organizations are fading. Civic involvement at all levels is fading. And I think it is we've sort of said, well, that's the government's job, not mine as a citizen. One of the great exceptions, which is uniquely American, is volunteer fire departments. And one by one, they're going away. But it used to be that we took care of our neighbors.
Steve, you're sounding scarily like President Kennedy asked not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. How do you try to instill that appreciation for freedom into your own grandchildren?
That's a good question. I don't know if I'm doing it well, but I was thinking about it as I was driving over here today. I had breakfast with a 24-year-old grandson this morning. I found myself during breakfast as he would talk about issues, and he's keenly interested in issues of national direction, world affairs. And I found myself, instead of trying to make points about specific things, I say, well, let me give you an example. And I would tell a story or experience, and I could tell it resonated with him. With our children, we've tried to do two things. One, I've been blessed in my life to have a lot of interesting experiences, not normal experiences. How many people have been shot at by Palestinian terrorists in the Middle East and shot at by drug terrorists in Latin America, those kind of things. I want to tell those stories to my children and grandchildren that they can learn from them. And there's always examples in those experiences.
And do they like listening to those stories?
They say they do, but I don't know. Maybe they're just polite.
I think not. I think they do.
If I got up and was lecturing them, they'd wander off. They'd be playing a game or whatever. If it's a story, they're attentive. And I'm amazed. Like a granddaughter called me the other day and she said, "Grandpa, you've never told me this story that another grandchild had shared with her." And it really, the stories of our lives are interesting to them.
Yes. And it seems like that's another thing we have gotten away from.
Because we're competing with social media, and we don't need to compete.
We don't, but we think we do.
Yeah, well, circumstances kind of force us to.
Yeah. Extended families don't live together anymore. We're a long way apart.
Used to be grandma was up the block.
And everybody's
across
busy.
the backfield.
Yeah, they're running to this and that and the other. And mom's taking kids to soccer games. Yep. And so when the grandparents do show up, it's like, oh, well, hi, and I know you're off to this, or I'll go off to this with you. And we keep thinking, I think, as grandparents, there's just not time, or they wouldn't be interested, or I don't really have anything interesting to say. And we do have interesting to say. I think we have lost a lot of that ability to transfer morality and beliefs and attributes to our grandchildren because we don't tell stories.
So I was with 3 granddaughters, all of whom are married recently, and they were in town, and they said, "We want to go to breakfast." who wants to go to breakfast, some old geezer? But we went to breakfast. And we got talking about some principles of honesty and integrity. And I found myself saying, let me tell you what I learned from my great uncle when he was 85 years old. And we were out plowing in the field. Let me tell you what I learned. And I shared those learning experiences. And I realized, and they sat there and listened attentively and then asked questions. If I'd given a lecture on the principles of honesty, they'd have tuned out.
Yeah. And you knew my dad.
Your dad was a great guy.
And my dad was a farmer, little town up in Idaho on the Oregon border. And as a kid, I could go into the town of Nissa, Oregon, or Parma, Idaho, and go into a store and just walk out and say, charge it to Charlie. Nobody would even blink an eye.
When I was a student at BYU undergrad school, I needed tuition money, which was $200 or something. And I remember I went into the little town bank in the small town where our family had been for generations. And I saw the banker, Brother Thomas. I told him what I needed. And he said, we're not supposed to make loans that little like that. But I knew your grandfather. I knew your great-grandfather. Here's the loan.
Yeah.
No big process, just family integrity.
Yeah. And the integrity was there. Like, I wouldn't have dreamed of misusing that privilege.
You would never.
Never, ever. It wouldn't even enter my mind. And I think that intrinsic honesty, that intrinsic love of freedom, that intrinsic caring for each other is still in everybody, but it gets squashed by social media.
Social media and the system.
And the system.
I remember being with my grandfather, and he did some transaction. I don't remember what it was. I was young.
Says your doc? Your grandfather that I know?
Yeah.
That one? Yeah.
But he came out and I said, well, don't you have to sign a contract? No, I shook hands.
Yeah.
He said, your handshake is worth far more than any piece of paper. I've never forgotten that.
My dad, as a young man, bought a farm like that.
Yeah, exactly. My grandfather was a doctor in a little town in Northern California during World War II, when the Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps. And I never learned this about him until years later after he died. And someone told me that many of his patients were Japanese American farmers. And when they're shipped off to these camps, they were going to lose their farms. And they would bring the deeds to their farm into his doctor's office and sign the deed over to him. And what did he do with them? Did he sell the farms? No, he threw the deeds all in a drawer. And at the end of the war, they came back and he signed the deeds back to him. Yeah. That's just integrity.
It is. And I think it is still there in us, but gets clobbered away by everything. And I think one of the responsibilities that grandparents have that they may not realize is to share those stories with the grandkids. Otherwise, they can read about it, they can hear about it on the internet, they can hear something. That means nothing. But if grandpa tells a story like you just did about your grandfather, wow, that means something because that's part of them. That's their heritage. That's their great-great-grandfather. And now I didn't realize it. I've got to behave different. And you never sit a lecture at all.
And there's sort of a kind of an expectation today of grandparents in America. If we're going to do something, we have to entertain them. Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think they don't want to be entertained. They may communicate that they want to, but they don't. They would much rather learn those life lessons from your experiences. Yeah. And they sit in awe.
Yeah. And people all have stories. They think they don't. I have so many people say, well, I don't have any stories. And I say, well, tell me about 3 experiences in your life that were really notable for you, times in your life. Okay. I said, now think of an experience in each one of those times. Okay. Tell me about that. Oh, well, this happened and this happened as you just told me a story. And what did you learn from that experience? Oh, you can do that with your grandchildren. And not only that, they will love it and they will love you. And they will learn something.
And their experience story may be on the farm. It may be at a baseball game. It doesn't matter.
No.
I remember this. I remember from my youth an uncle telling me a story about the time that the fire alarm went off for the volunteer fire department. And how he ran 5 blocks. And when he got 5 blocks to the fire station, realized he forgot to put his pants on. And there was more to the story, but I remember that.
Yeah. I think that is one of the ways we can return to those values is by grandparents, great-grandparents spending more time telling those stories.
But, and I agree completely, but we're competing at the outset with devices.
I've not, you can tell your experience, but I have not had that problem when I've been telling stories to my grandchildren.
Well, once you start, but it's the starting.
Yeah. Yeah. We think they won't listen.
Oh, they do. They sit
They
there
will listen.
and they'll ask questions and they'll say, well, what did you really did that? What about this?
Yeah. You know, and every story doesn't need to turn into a grand discussion of freedom or something like that. Some stories are just for fun. But often they will start asking questions. Well, Grandpa, why did that happen?
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. Well, how did you feel? And that gives you the chance to say, well, have you had this experience like that? Well, yeah, I did this. And how did you feel? What happened? And now you've engaged in a real conversation that I think we do too infrequently.
For a conversation to be any good, it's got to be two-way.
Yeah.
You can't talk down to them. And
you can once.
I remember Harold B. Lee said, I love this quote. He said, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that proportion. Well, and our grandchildren have things to share with us.
Yeah. And they're quite often quite brilliant. Quite insightful.
Surprisingly so.
You've been around as many prophets as you have presidents. What do you remember from conference talks?
I remember Richard McConkey's last conference talk.
Don't we all?
Little moments is all I remember. And I don't remember so much what was said, but what I felt. And what I felt was a interpretation of some principle. And I remember President Hinckley tearing up when he would bear testimony. It wasn't so much what he said as, again, what I felt with his emotion of his testimony. Of course, President Nelson, of course, maybe that's because he's more recent. I do remember some things he has very specifically said, but snippets only. I remember Joseph Worthland. It was one of the greatest general conference lessons I've ever seen. Elder Worthland was speaking at the pulpit, and he began to tremble. I mean, really, really tremble, full body tremble. He was in trouble physically, but he persevered. And his fellow quorum member, Russell Nelson, stands up and grabs him by the belt and holds his brother in the quorum up while he speaks. Okay? No, never a word was said between the two. Most powerful sermon I think I've ever experienced in General Conference.
Yeah.
That we were there, so we were up close and we could see. After Elder Worthland finished and sat down, then his quorum brother, Russell Nelson, is on his knees in front of Elder Worthland's chair, face to face, ministering to his quorum brother, right in the middle of conference. That's a General Conference sermon I remember.
Yeah. It was a story you witnessed.
Yes. And you kind of felt like you were part of this unfolding story because you're in the congregation cheering silently, Elder Worthland, you can do this. You can,
Yeah. I remember watching that on conference. And first was, what's going on here?
Yeah, he had a medical episode.
Yeah. And then you can see what happened. And he was determined to finish that talk.
Oh, I remember when President Hunter collapsed, stood right back up and kept right on going.
Yeah.
What he was talking about, I don't know. But I remember the message of his perseverance.
I remember as a mission leader in Africa, I would sometimes be trying to teach him a piece of doctrine or something like that so he get it. My wife would always teach in Zone Conference the Sunday message of the day. The next month, they had no idea what I said.
They remember what she said.
All of them remembered the Sunday message of the day.
We had the same experience.
But what is it about us that we want to lecture? We want to.
I don't want to. No, I don't want to because they don't want to hear it.
Well, I know they don't want to hear it, but I think sometimes it comes from good intentions. We have so much we want to get across that we try to do it.
Yeah, there's no question about that.
And as we try to do that, we lose it all.
You know, you mentioned earlier Ronald Reagan. I can remember speeches he gave, and I heard hundreds of them. I don't know what he said, but I remember what he said through stories. And I remember once it was a Memorial Day speech he was giving. And he gave some platitudes about American freedom and Memorial Day and all of that. What I remember is he shared a story about a letter he got from a girl whose father had been in World War II and his experience. That's what I remember.
Yeah.
And Reagan was a master at using stories to make a point.
And you don't have to be Ronald Reagan to do that.
No. Every person has stories. Every person.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether they're in jail, whether they're the bishop, whether they're the governor, every person. They can be one of the great lessons I learned was a long haul truck driver. It was General Priesthood Conference. I was attending at some church building in Mesquite, Nevada. Okay. Bonnie and I were traveling through and stopped it, and I went in. Bonnie sat in the car, and she has talked about this for years since. A big 18-wheeler semi pulls up. A guy in a blue work shirt gets out of the truck, the driver, right there in the street, changes into a white shirt, puts on a tie, and goes into church. Bonnie has talked about what she saw in that moment in this faithful priesthood holder. And there was no sermon, but that was his story.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad to hear that story. I mean, that changes the way I think about things a little bit because I know that story now.
And she tells it much better than I do.
Yeah. But stories are just impactful, and we seem to have lost the art or the will or the ability or the know-how to do that. And all we have to do is start. I think sometimes people think, well, if I'm going to tell a story, I have to have a beginning and end and a protagonist. No, you don't. You just start, when I was a kid, this happened, or when I was here, this happened, or I was thinking about your aunt and what she did to me or for me sometime. And you're telling a story. That's all there is to it. But they have so much impact. It seems like the younger generation is inundated with all kinds of mental, emotional, depression, anxiety, one thing after another. I don't know why. Power lines, plastics, maybe a little bit of everything. It kind of doesn't matter. But they get a lot of the inputs they get from social media or from the internet. But that does not come with feelings and emotion and context the way a simple story from grandpa or grandma does. And that's one of the things I think the younger generation is missing a lot of. Part because they're divided, part because they don't live in extended families, part because they're all over the country, part because they're so busy.
They're way too busy. I look at our younger grandchildren. Where they got piano lessons or they got dance lessons or they got to be at a soccer match or lacrosse or they got to be at Little League. Run. Constant. And when I see them, we kind of just, hello, good to see you, goodbye.
Yeah. I'm really skilled, but I never learned humanity. I never learned to feel. I never learned those little tiny lessons. And that, I think, is our responsibility as parents, as grandparents, as great-grandparents. It's not just to provide food on the table. It's to share wisdom. It's to share experiences. It's to share stories. That's how they pick up those attributes that are so important.
I remember I had an old great aunt, and she was old. She was a widow. She was not well.
Yeah.
And there was a neighbor family. They lived out on a farm. And the farm across the road, every night, the lady of the farm, when she fixed dinner for her family, made one extra plate for her neighbor lady. And one of the children every night would bring over a plate. And there was always an interesting interplay between the child delivering the plate and my great aunt on the receiving end. And I was there with one of our boys once, and when this neighbor boy came over with dinner, he's never forgotten that the neighbor, whole family, took time to bring a plate of dinner to her every night.
You know, I just read a book by a fellow who grew up in Pocatello and has been kind of in the business of promoting books and doing things for BYU in the video and the television area. But his grandfather served in World War II with 5 of his brothers, all from Pocatello. They were all out at the same time.
Wow.
And he started thinking, my grandchildren aren't going to know a thing about that. So he wrote this book. I can't remember the title right now, but it's about snippets from all these grandparents who were out in different theaters of the war, and the letters that they were writing home, and what was going on in their lives, and what was going on with the people in their lives. And I've read dozens and dozens of books about World War II in all the theaters. Nothing's ever impacted me like reading his stories of how it affected that whole family and that whole community, and how they all came together, and the lessons each of those grandfathers learned.
Some years ago, and I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, I'm guessing totally, Spanish Fork High School, English class students, their assignment was they had to go interview a family member who served in World War II and write their story.
Yeah.
It was extraordinary. And, I think of my own father. He was a bomber pilot in World War II, but he never talked about it. These assignments to go interview them caused this whole dialogue to occur, and it was so successful, extraordinary success.
Yeah.
That they did it again the following year and published a book about it.
Yeah.
When our oldest son wanted to know about my father's exploits in World War II after my father died, he actually found his old bomber crew, who were, by then 85 or whatever, went around and interviewed them all. Tell me about my grandfather in World War II.
And if he'd waited another 10 years,
they were all gone.
All gone.
Yeah.
The stories were all gone.
Yeah.
So there's an urgency to this.
One of them said they were in North Africa. And this old vet who since passed said to our son, Mark, he said, I loved your grandfather, best bomber pilot I ever flew with. And the best thing we ever did was a 3-day beer run to Cairo.
But again, doesn't matter, does it?
No.
It brings the humanity into things that we sometimes, they did this or this. No, they were a human being.
Yep. And Mark remembers every word of that story.
Yeah, I bet he does.
And it's told his children.
Well, the name of this book, I just remember, is Ross Park. It's fairly new. And again, it took him years to write it because he had to get letters from all these people and put it together. And he tells really a lot of what was going on in each theater, in each place. So he did a lot of studies. And I thought, you know what? If those letters had been thrown away, he couldn't have written the book.
And, people keep letters.
Yeah.
For years.
We don't anymore. We don't write letters. What if it's on the internet?
That's good or bad.
But Steve, yeah, I really appreciate this.
Sort of like my brilliant speech the other night at the Family History Center. Nothing stayed on script.
No. And I found that in doing sessions like this, almost always the best material is off script when you just get talking or telling stories.
Stories are such an underutilized commodity. I think about it in Sacramento. We had a Stake Relief Society leader speak in our Sacramento recently. She taught a lot of good doctrinal principles. I don't remember what they are, but she told a story about her grandfather on the farm, and I remember exactly that story and the principle the story taught.
Yeah. So audience out there, tell stories, write them down, talk to your grandchildren, get engaged in conversations. And there are things beyond sports and football and food and television that you can talk about. And your grandchildren are absolutely hungry for you to tell stories.
I'm guessing that most people don't realize they are hungry. But the minute you engage them with those stories, they sit and listen and ask questions. And you can assess their listening level later by the way they're telling it to their siblings.
When I'm up in Spanish Fork with my grandchildren up there, so are you going to tell us bedtime stories? Can we get some bedtime stories? What am I going to say?
Fall asleep ahead of time. You'll be okay.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to be with me.
It's a great privilege.
I hope that we can find a way to convince people of the value of their wisdom and their experiences and sharing that with the grandchildren.
You know, one of the things we're seeing in modern civilization, not just in America, but sort of in varying degrees universally, deterioration of the family unit. And this is one of those things that could have a great impact on restoring the family unit strength.
100% agree. Thank you.
In our next episodes, we'll explore other attributes that have shaped our lives and how storytelling can make a real difference in the lives of others. We'll also be inviting guests from all walks of life to share their attributes and stories and how they've tried to pass them on to a younger generation. If you'd like to learn more about me or my book, Stories That Shape Us, visit steve-mann.com, where you can download a free bonus chapter on discussing controversial issues with family and friends, something most of us tend to avoid. You can also share your own stories or attributes you'd like to see us cover here on the channel. Join us next time as we continue exploring how the stories from your life can become a gift of experience for others. And if this episode resonated with you, please subscribe and invite someone you care about to join you. Also, please send us a note on how you are sharing your wisdom with your children and grandchildren. Remember, you can make a difference.